From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the National Book Festival. My name is Andrea Roan. I anchor the morning news on WUSA 9. We're the CBS affiliate here in Washington. As a reporter, I would love to have covered this story. 1909, the call went out inviting all who believe in democracy to a national conference dedicated to the renewal of the struggle for civil and political liberty. In a New York City apartment on the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth, 60 black and white citizens answered that call. What came of it? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. For most of us, that's where the story ends. We don't know much more about it, or we don't realize how much more there is to know about it. What we do know is the NAACP has had the backs of black Americans for all of its existence. Now, on the centennial of that pivotal gathering, a monumental book, the definitive history of the oldest civil rights organization, has been written by noted author and historian Dr. Patricia Sullivan. It is Lift Every Voice, the NAACP, and the Making of the Civil Rights Movement. The late Dr. John Hope Franklin called it an exciting account of the organization. Dr. Sullivan will tell you it was a huge chunk of her life, 10 years spent on research and writing. She too is a history detective, unearthing clues explaining the little-known existence in the early decades of the NAACP, its activism, its growth, its influence. She recounts the personal bravery and legal brilliance by civil rights giants in its founding, but she also shares the unheralded stories of ordinary people whose sacrifices also led to justice for all. Please welcome author of Lift Every Voice, Dr. Patricia Sullivan.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and I want to thank the Library of Congress and all of the sponsors of the National Book Festival for making this possible. And thank all of you for being here. As you just learned, many of you maybe knew, but many maybe didn't know that this is the 100th anniversary year of the nation's oldest civil rights organization. I set out to write a history of the NAACP a decade ago at the invitation of Joe Wood, an editor at the New Press. And it's sort of an amazing coincidence that it's being published in the year of the centennial. I was a little late on delivery, but actually it's been wonderful to be part of the celebration of the centennial. And in many of the conversations I've had in the past months, people would ask, what does the history mean? Why did you do it? And questions focused specifically on the organization. And really, the history I wrote is more than a history of an institution. It really is a history of the black freedom struggle in the 20th century. And as a teacher of history and a teacher who works with teachers, the public memory of the civil rights movement pretty much begins with the Brown decision and the Montgomery bus boycott. And there's really no public memory of those intervening years between the founding of the NAACP in 1909 and the 1950s. But 2 generations prior to 1954 laid the groundwork that made the gains of the 60s possible and really shaped the process of racial change in our country for the past century. I'd like to make sort of 4 big observations based on this work that just covers an ocean of material. First is that this book really does capture a hidden history. And in doing that, sort of resets the signposts of the civil rights movement. From its founding in 1909 up to the 1950s, the NAACP really laid the infrastructure for attacking racial barriers in the South, trying to stop the spread of racial discrimination in the North, and revive a movement for full civic and political equality. It was a movement coordinated by a handful of people out of a New York office, and they were always struggling for money. They had no major donors. They were dependent on members for their funds. From the beginning, they began challenging the caste system in the South. They were founded in a response to a race riot in Springfield, Illinois. So they were concerned about racial practices spreading north from the South. And very early on, they established a lobbying presence here in Washington. When Woodrow Wilson expanded segregation through the federal government, they came, they exposed that, protested that, and stayed here, and really were positioned to shape the fight for civil rights legislation that would unfold and culminate in the 1960s. A second major point and major accomplishment, really, of the NAACP's is the role of law in sort of providing the engine for change during the first half of the 20th century, and really targeting the underpinnings of Jim Crow in the South, and really succeeding in expanding the protection of constitutional rights for all. And that whole project really developed right here at Howard University, and centered around a man, Charles Houston, who some of you may know, but too many people don't know Charles Houston. He is a pivotal figure in American history, not just civil rights history. And Houston was the dean of Howard Law School in the early 1930s. And he believed, you know, African Americans pretty much couldn't vote in the South. That's where most of them lived. He believed that the law and black lawyers working through the courts could transform the South over several decades. So a tough litigation strategy really connected with people in the South to begin to move up against the barriers of Jim Crow. Over at Howard, he trained a generation of law students in the early 30s, including Thurgood Marshall. And in 1934, he became special counsel of the NAACP, and he sort of implemented this vision. And for the next 2 decades, leading to Brown, they laid the groundwork both through developing cases that chipped around at the edges of segregation, and most importantly, getting people in the South and Southern communities involved in organizing, to go to court, and to make demands for change. And so really, field work was a major part of what they did. Thurgood Marshall, who succeeded Houston as special counsel in 1940, in the early 1940s, he traveled 40,000 miles a year. So he was in the field, working with people, helping them organize, developing cases, urging people to try and vote. And they worked in a number of areas: transportation, voting, equal education opportunities. And when they decided, after World War II, Marshall and his associates decided it was really time to go directly up against segregation. And for Southern blacks in the South in this period, that was a leap of imagination, and really, it would take tremendous courage. And he talked about telling people in South Carolina about this plan. And he reported the people just looked at him, you know? There was no applause, they just looked at him. In 4 years, the major first case that would comprise Brown came out of South Carolina. And I just want to read a brief passage from the book that indicates the kind of transformation that took place with these lawyers working with these communities who did want better education for their children and finally realized challenging segregation was essential. So I just want to read a short passage. Okay. Sorry. Oh, dear. Before dawn, on the morning of May 28, 1851, the first day of the trial, Eliza Briggs met her neighbors at St. Mark's Church in Somerton and joined a caravan of cars headed for Charleston. Black men and women began lining up outside the courthouse at sunrise and continued coming all morning. By the time the lawyers arrived, the line stretched from the second-story courtroom down the hallway, through the lobby, down the front steps, and along the sidewalk. The courtroom seated 150. More than 500 people waited, and more came. Eliza Briggs was guaranteed a seat given that the case bore her family name, Briggs versus Elliott. James Gibson, a farmer who rode over from Clarendon County, was among the 100 who lined up outside. I never got tired of standing that day, he said. During the course of the trial, news found its way to Gibson and the others gathered along the hallway and on the street. Whenever an NAACP lawyer made a point, Poston recalled, someone got up, whispered it to the line, and it would travel right down the corridor and down the steps to the throng outside. A month after that case, Thurgood Marshall reflected on that scene, and he said, the Negroes from Clarendon County and from all over the South jammed the courthouse, standing shoulder to shoulder, hot and uncomfortable, for a single purpose, to demonstrate to all the world that Negroes in the South are determined to eliminate segregation from American life. So he saw the future. He saw the sit-ins, the freedom rides. Nothing would stop this spirit, not even the massive resistance that greeted the Brown decision. A third observation, again, that this history reveals so powerfully is the grassroots nature of the movement that develops during the first 5 decades of the 20th century. And again, this working, small group in New York, very little money, field workers going out, a former high school teacher, Du Bois, a number of people going out into the field, connecting up with people around the country, cultivating branches, and branches growing up around issues that people face, be it jobs, the struggle for equal education, criminal justice issues, voting, and the like. And this infrastructure, this sort of energy between the national office and communities throughout the country, from the Mississippi Delta to California, Seattle, Boston, created again an infrastructure tied to a national movement demanding national citizenship rights. And what became so apparent to me as I studied this history, researched it up at the library, was the constant terror, violence, and threats that people faced. I mean, they struggled forward under tremendous obstacles and often in the face of great danger. And one of the cases that was quite striking, I mean, if you think it was dangerous to be a civil rights worker in the 1960s, and it was, imagine being a civil rights worker in the South in the 1940s. Elbert Williams was one of those people. He helped establish the branch in Brownsville, Tennessee in 1940, and they organized a voter registration drive in anticipation of the presidential election. Elbert Williams was taken, abducted by a mob from his house. A sheriff was in the mob of people who took him, and his body was found 2 days later in the river. The NAACP had made some advances in Washington. They were able to get the Justice Department to investigate this case. Thurgood Marshall investigated it on his own and found people who had been there that night, got affidavits, and really got the evidence of what had happened, who had been there. And the Justice Department, after 2 years, concluded there was not enough evidence to bring a suit. Now that was in 1942, that was finally resolved that way. And the interesting thing is, 2 years later, the white primary is overturned, and the growth of black voter registration that just burst forward with veterans coming back, even again in the face of these sorts of threats, was just remarkable. And again, these lawyers and these communities working together made that possible. A final point is that the major successes, and I've highlighted them today, that the NAACP was so pivotal in securing, happened in the South. And the South is what we think of when we think of civil rights struggles, very dramatic, eyes on the prize, the final overturning of Jim Crow, which built on all of this work that I've learned about as I studied and wrote this book. But as I mentioned, the NAACP was founded in response to the spread of racial discrimination in the North. And a major theme in this history is the fight around that. You know, for the whole first half century, blacks migrated north seeking opportunity and a better chance. And as people came north in larger numbers, racial barriers tightened in northern cities, and you saw in housing, education, and all aspects of public life. Excuse me, just get a drink. Housing was a major focus of legal activity and community activity. The NAACP won a Supreme Court case in 1917 overturning residential ordinances, which would have divided cities up almost like apartheid, legally separating them based on race. They overturned that. Then restrictive covenants were implemented. They challenged that in the courts. It took 20 years, but in 1948, restrictive covenants were overturned. By that time, government money was supporting public housing, urban renewal, expansion of housing in the aftermath of World War II, and there was a great effort to have no discrimination clauses included in federal appropriations, and that didn't succeed. And so what you see in this history is the expansion of racial segregation despite these efforts to contain it, to push it back. And that is a place that continues, and that really, we live with the consequences of that today. This segregation that grew up outside of the legal caste system in the South, that we see persisting in our schools, in housing patterns, in incarceration rates. So it's a story that doesn't have an end, and really underscores some of the deep constraints in our history that has continued to sustain racial division and inequality. But in the end, this history is a hopeful one at its core. I mean, to have spent 10 years researching and learning about people who came together and faced what often seemed like insurmountable odds and found a way forward. And it was a belief in, and really enacting a reality beyond racial division and acting on the promise of American democracy, just going into the political arena, developing the tools in litigation, lobbying, organizing, and never losing sight of the rights of all to full citizenship. And as I was finishing my book last fall, I was reading through Charles Houston's columns in the Baltimore Afro-American, and this was a month before the election. And what I found was really a testimony to that spirit. You know, in 1949, okay, 60 years before the inauguration of the first African-American president, Charles Houston went here on Pennsylvania Avenue with his son, a 6-year-old son, to observe Harry Truman's inaugural parade. And I'd like to read from you what happened. He wrote as he looked out onto this crowd that had gathered along Pennsylvania Avenue, wondering, quote, if the first black president of the United States was among the children watching the parade, in person or by television, or listening to it on the radio, or whether he has been born. Maybe, he told his readers, if we can speed our rate of progress and self-discipline, some of us may live to see him inaugurated. By then, though, it will not make any difference what blood he has. The sole question to be simply whether he is the best man or woman, why not, for the job. Thank you.
I have a question. Could you comment on the role of the press in either the successes or setbacks during the first half, the pre-television era, to the NAACP?
On the role of the press.
Role or influence, impact.
Okay. Well, the African-American press was pivotal because they got the news out and really were, you know, with court victories, headlines, and sort of kind of brought this information and out there, and people shared it, and it really embraced the victories and made them deeply and broadly significant. The mainstream press often ignored what was happening. A lot of this happened under the radar, and I think, I mean, you had some reporters who were paying attention and writing about this, especially during World War II. But I would say, you know, during the Wilson era, when Wilson segregated the federal government, they came and investigated that, put a report out, because he didn't announce it, they just did it. And they sent that to every major newspaper, and the press picked it up and attacked Wilson for officializing racial prejudice. So it depended on the time, and their job to get the information out, and then you would get that sort of response that this was not tolerable to have segregation in Washington. So it's uneven, and I think, but the black press was enormously important during these decades. Thanks.
A question over here. Thank you for coming. Despite the myriad of laws that provide for protections on race and the well-known knowledge that it's against the law to discriminate on the basis of race, can you account for why it's still so prevalent and why a lot of people still don't believe it's happening?
Well, you know, as John Hope Franklin said, if you study history, that's part of the answer. You know, I talked about the persistence, even in the face of a very active effort to alert people to what was happening and to, you know, to change things. So I think in our history, that's part of the answer, looking at why not and what are the structures that push up against that. But I think you mentioned something about civil rights law, and we sort of take that for granted. And what grew out of this history, one major part of it, coming out of Howard Law School, using the courts to expand, really give the 14th Amendment meaning, and that really lays the groundwork. I mean, you have Brown and then the civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s, which puts laws on the books, but the history also shows that enforcement of the law, interpretation of the law, it can get set back, it can be more narrowly interpreted. It's an ongoing struggle, ongoing challenge, and I think the tools are there, but they have to be used. Thanks.
The idea of a talented 10th, a special elite among, you know, so-called colored people, how prominent or how much of a philosophy was that as part of the origins in the early days of the NAACP? Do you think it was significant?
Well, the talented 10th. W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, and probably its most important figure. I mean, for 25 years he edited The Crisis and really was a powerhouse in building this national movement. The talented 10th are people who've had the opportunity for education, and I think as you see, these lawyers are part of the talented 10th. With that is the notion of service, of giving back to the community. And within the context of the NAACP's history, you see people taking that knowledge, that opportunity that they had, Du Bois, the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard, and putting it back into building a movement for change and working shoulder to shoulder with community people, local people, people who didn't have that opportunity. So I think the talented 10th in this context is taking the education, the opportunity, and using it. And it was critically important. I mean, to have some of the best constitutional lawyers in the country working within the context of the NAACP was essential to building a movement to overturn segregation, which depended on local people moving forward and making the demand. Okay.
I'm very curious, since you're obviously not a person of color, how you got interested in African American history, and also the fact that you're not a person of color, the perspective you have on the story that you wrote, and if you were a person of color, would it come out a different way?
Well, I'm a historian of American history, and when I was a graduate student, I had a wonderful teacher who was writing a biography of Paul Robeson, and I was his research assistant. I went south, and I started to learn a lot about what was happening in the South in the 1940s, and that then became a central interest of mine, seeing our history through the African American experience, and it just has been something I've pursued for the last 25, 30 years. I think perspective, you know, we all bring different perspectives, and the person who asked me to write the book was African American Joe Wood, because he had read my earlier work. And so all I can say is I think as a historian, I understand that the black experience is definitive in the American experience. And I think in writing this history, it shines a light on American history. I think that's the best you can do, is just listen to your sources and immerse yourself in the lives and experiences of the people who made the history and try to interpret it as best you can. Thanks.
Hi. This may be my imagination, but I think it seems like in the last 5 to 8 or so years, I've heard more and more people, including African Americans, talk about there's no longer a need for the NAACP. Has your antenna picked any of that up?
No. And people ask about what is the NAACP doing today, how does it relate to its history. But I think when you look at the challenges and, you know, what made this organization work were people sort of taking ownership, right? Working through the branches. And, you know, the branches ebb and flow. Leadership is different in different parts of the country. But I think what made it so successful in these formative foundational decades was it connecting up with people in communities around the country and people in those local communities giving of their time and effort to work in tandem with the national organization, national effort. So it's, you know, looking to the top to make, you know, leadership's important. And I think the new CEO, Benjamin Jealous, is very, really a very impressive and energetic leader. But I think it's, you know, it still is the one organization with branches throughout the country and this sort of infrastructure that lets you connect local problems to national citizenship. I mean, to what your right is as a citizen of the United States. Can't hear you.
I guess I just think it's interesting that nobody talks about the YWCA, B'nai B'rith, the Daughters of American, you know, Revolution, but the NAACP seems to be that. And then this is this, and no one ever says, oh, do we need the YWCA anymore or anything like that? That's kind of what I was getting at.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. As you know, one of the origin of the NAACP focused around the lynching experience in the South, particularly of blacks. I mean, at that time, they were literally being lynched at the drop of a dime. And Ida Wells Burnett was one of the supporters of anti-lynching laws, and particularly on the federal level, because she knew that the states, particularly southern states, really didn't give a damn. What was Ida Wells Burnett's relationship to the NAACP? As I understand it, she felt somewhat slighted because she felt that during the origins of the NAACP, it was a predominantly male organization. And as a woman, she felt that she wasn't taken seriously. My second question is, with Du Bois migrating to, going to Ghana during the latter part of his life.
Well, let me answer that one because I think we're running out of time. Your first question is a very important one. Ida B. Wells, one of the great civil rights leaders, organized the anti-lynching campaign. She was a founding member of the NAACP. And in the beginning, there was some conflict within the organization, and she pretty much withdrew from active participation. She worked with them through the Chicago branch. So she's enormously important. You know, and again, in studying this history, the personal tensions that are a part of any organization are there. I mean, and I write about them. But even in spite of those, they go forward. And women, Katherine Johnson early on, May Nerney, there were a number of women involved in important ways. But the work of Ida B. Wells, she laid the foundation. I mean, the first decade of the 20th century, when the NAACP was founded, there were 900 lynchings in the South. And again, to convey to you the terror and the violence that is the context of all of this, that's so important. And her drive for national legislation, essential, picked up by the NAACP. And James Weldon Johnson, one of the great leaders, mounted a campaign here in Washington in the early 1920s, a lobbying campaign working on Capitol Hill, got a bill passed by the House of Representatives and before the Senate, It was defeated by a filibuster, which sets in the pattern that you'll see throughout the 20th century, but really helped to revive and put this, this issue on the map. So, you know, her work was carried forward through others, but she made an enormous contribution and is a major figure. Can we? I think we should let everybody have one. Sorry, thanks.
Thank you. Can you draw many or any connections, direct connections, between activists of the pre-Civil War abolitionist movement or post-Civil War work to help sustain the ambitions of Reconstruction before it collapsed in the 1870s with the founders of the NAACP? I know there's a 30 to 40-year gap in there. And who would they be?
Well, specifically, I mean, I think the most important connection is the memory. You know, the call was sent out on Lincoln's birthday. A number of the founders, Oswald Garrison Villard was the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison. Mary White Obington was the child of a person who was active in anti-slavery movement. And they looked to that and Reconstruction to revive. Again, memory. We talked about memory. They were so much mindful of what had been and what could be, and that claim on this country being what it said it was. So in terms of specific people, I think of just the direct connections that the founders had with individuals who were active, and you know, with the memory of Reconstruction. I mean, Du Bois wrote the first massive history of Reconstruction. That was very much on their minds, and I think that really made them feel hopeful of what could be done to sort of continue and build on those earlier traditions and successes. Thank you. That's it. Oh, I think I'm sorry. I'd be glad to talk with you over here, but our time is up. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.